this thing that I called, its provisional title, Learning from the Event, How Extinction Articulates Human Temporalities, I sort of attempt to draw from Deleuze's concept of the event as he develops in Difference in Repetition and in The Logic of Sense, in order to try and distinguish between two ways of understanding the problem that has mostly recently been thematized under this sort of rubric of the problem of human extinction. How do we think about the extinction of humans? So on the one hand, I think that we can identify what Deleuze would call an accidental model of extinction, which posits extinction as something that would be located in our future and that may or may not happen. This is the model that is at the core of cultural symbols, like the doomsday clock that was created in 1947 by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. So it's 90 seconds before midnight. But on the other hand, I think that it's possible to think through the extinction of humanity as an event that traverses and constitutes the temporality of our existences rather than being positioned at a certain postulated point in time. So my argument is that the purely predictive model of extinction, which understands it as something that will be effectuated at a localizable point in time, misses the true sense of futurity that is embedded in the event of extinction, which is a principle that organizes our human worlds, that individuates our lives in a specific articulation of time. And I think that the event plays a role in the very constitution of time as opposed to the accidents, which happens in time. So, brings me to my sort of first part. My first question is, has it happened already? And asking the question might sound a little foolish, almost pointless. How could I even formulate these words if the world had ended? If I, along with my fellow humans, had gone extinct, right? I wish, nonetheless, to take this hypothesis seriously, because I believe that Deleuze's concept of event allows us to reveal a sense of extinction that would account for its temporal deployment. So in The Logic of Sense, 1969, Deleuze deepens his discussion of the event, which he had begun to flesh out in Difference in Repetition, published the year before. The first thing to note about the event is that taking in itself as the pure event, it is distinct from the accident or for any form of empirical occurrence in the world. For instance, saying that I could not even ask the question as to whether extinction had already happened if its answer was positive, that's a reaction that hinges on a specific conception of extinction. It requires to understand extinction as a sort of circumscribed portion of time in which the complete destruction of humanity would occur. This schema presupposes a pre-existing linear chronology, a global time of human history, in which we progress from present to present towards a future. Extinction, as the happening of humanity's downfall and destruction, can only be in the future, at least as long as we are here to talk about it. If we stick to this conception, the attempt at counting extinction as one of those things that have already happened, it's simply meaningless, right? No way to ask the question even. Okay, let's get into Deleuze's weird stuff. As we know, Deleuze's philosophy of time, primarily developed in Difference in Repetition, it emphasizes the antecedence of specific repetitions over any overarching arrow of time, right? Time is constituted through three different syntheses that do not have a linear chronology as their end result. So, quick spiel on the synthesis of time in Difference and Repetition. The first synthesis, modeled on Hume's empiricism, is the one that, quote, constitutes time as present, but as present that passes, end quote. The registering of a change, so you register a change, a difference, along with the contraction of this registering into a habitus, and that constitutes the building block of temporal passage. The terms that are subjected to change, or the terms that are repeated, so a ringing sound that repeats itself, or a sudden variation in the tone of the ringing, those are originally indifferent and unknown to time. Their change is not taking place within any kind of temporality prior to its being captured by a contemplation that articulates it as a passage. A contemplation that can be a human subject who enjoys a melody, right? Me listening to music. But it can also be a cellular organism that registers the presence of nutrient in its environment, articulating past and future according to the fulfillment of a need, right? So this is not just a contemplation of human contemplations. There's many types of contemplations. So this is how the present passes. The second synthesis is memory. It's the first, if the first synthesis is the fondation, right, the foundation of time, the second synthesis is its fondement, its grounding. It is not reducible to the present that has passed. It is rather the, quote, element in which we aim at the ancient present, end quote. So memory is therefore not the collection of things that took place empirically. Those are articulated in the synthesis of habitus, right, in the synthesis of present. This synthesis, the first one, it made possible their chronological unfurling, their passing in time. Memory is distinct from retention, which pertains to the present, right, because it's part of this unfolding. Following Bergson's matter and memory, Deleuze defines the second synthesis as the constitution of the time, quote, that does not pass, but that makes possible the passage of all presence, quote, what makes the present pass. So it's the locus in which presents that came to pass are encountered, but this locus itself cannot be encountered, as it can never, as pure past, or the being in itself of the past, as Deleuze says, it can never be made present. Like, we can, I know it's imperfect as an analogy, but we can think here of a sort of dreamscape, like this sort of place of pure remembrance when we're having a dream. Nothing there is present. Everything can only be encountered in a sort of reminiscence, right? So this is, the dream is a good way, I think, to think about the second synthesis, but also it's a flawed way. Anyways, the third synthesis, it concerns the future, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on here, the third synthesis. With the first two syntheses, we noticed that the constitution of temporality for Deleuze takes place throughout the fortuitous interactions of terms that were external to each other. The repeated sounds are unrelated until a listener, herself external to the sounds, articulates them into a series. The pure past, in which all past presents coexist simultaneously, is not synthesized following pre-existing principles of connection that would be internal to the terms themselves. So, for instance, François Zurabik-Villy stresses the fact that, quote, the relation is contingent, hazardous, because it can never be deduced from the nature of the terms that it connects. An encounter is always inexplicable, end quote. So the key element here, and I want to very stress that, the key element is that nothing necessitates the accomplishment of the temporal articulations that occur in the first two syntheses. It just happens. If nothing in the world necessitates those connections, it means that underneath the fondation of the present and the fondement of the pure past, there remains an irreducible sans fond, a groundlessness, an absence of necessity. So beyond the apparent solidity of temporal articulated series of presents and beyond the simultaneous coexistence of those series in a virtual past, there is an absence of ground that always eventually makes its way to the surface, i.e., it always eventually becomes experienced. And this experience is precisely the accomplishment of the third synthesis, which reveals, quote, the empty form of time as it denounces the illusion of the in itself. It's like the moment where you realize that nothing necessitated any of that. Time is just contingent on those encounters and those syntheses, those contractions, those contemplations. So the third synthesis reveals that every serialization is a product, and its result, the result of the third synthesis, is another product. It's the future, but a true sense of future, not the future as another type of present, a real future. If the arrow of the present, traced by the first synthesis, is filled with the chronological series that include the protensions and retentions, and if the virtual past is filled with coherently serialized past presents, the future, which is open in the third synthesis, appears in its full, complete, and utter indeterminacy, in its fundamental emptiness, which is also the truth of time. Okay. Hope How are we doing? It's good? It's okay? Because now we're getting into the event. How does the event fit in here? Is the event something of the present that grounds time as a point of originality? Is the event the ringing that makes it possible to, is it the Ursprung of the present? Or is it the immemorial element of the pure past in which all present coexists? So, no, that's not that. Even though the event engages dimensions that belong to the first two syntheses, it truly comes into play at the level of the third one. This is because the event has to do with the surfacing of the groundless. Remember, it becomes encountered. The surfacing gets experienced at some point, and that's what the event is about. When the groundless rises to the surface, it does something to us. It shuffles the serializations that were accomplished in the first two syntheses, and it redistributes them into new arrangement. David Lapoujade eloquently describes the event as the expression of this redistribution. Quote, "The event demonstrates the action of the sans fond, the groundless, on us. Something happens that changes everything, that moves the powers and capacities around," end quote. That's why the paradigmatic example of the event for Deleuze, of course, it's death. To be confronted with one's own death fragilizes the coherent composition of series that structures one's life. So my daily existence, it bears the traces of my childhood and my teenage years. I am located right now in a here and now that contains these horizons of past in a sort of coherent manner, right? I sort of contract all of these things in my present. And my personal future appears to me as another type of present, right? 10 years from now, my daily existence will more or less resemble and repeat my daily existence right now. I will shower in the morning, go to bed at night, drink water during the day. Being confronted with death, it opens a tear in the future, which suddenly becomes completely irreducible to any type of other present. The future can no longer be opened through the modality of anticipation. Death is the event that fractures life, but not because it kills. It does not cause the empirical cessation of a life, but because it brings the groundless to the surface. I'm going to quote Deleuze here, long quote, bear with me. "Death does not appear in the objective model of an indifferent inanimate matter to which the living would return. It is present in the living in the form of a subjective and differentiated experience endowed with its prototype. It is not a material state. On the contrary, having renounced all matter, it corresponds to a pure form, the empty form of time." End quote. I'm going to need a sip of water after reading that. So, understood as an event, death becomes irreducible to its empirical manifestation. Death does not have to be accomplished in fact. I do not have to be dead in order for the event to affect me, in order for it to shatter the bearings that anchored me into a here and now, which made sense, right? And which made my life cohere. In the same way, it is not required, and that's sort of like the hocus pocus that I'm trying to pull off here, it is not required that all humans vanish from the surface of the earth to talk about extinction as the event that structures our relationship to the future. The happening of the event is not subordinated to any definitive actualization. My death will always ever be to come, and yet it has also already happened. In the same way, total extinction will always ever be to come, all the while having already happened. So, I'm saying those things that it happened, but what does that mean? How does an event happen? And most importantly, how do we know it has happened? Why can I say those things right now? In other words, how do we distinguish the event from a simple accident? So I believe that we can identify at least three main characteristics in Deleuze's concept of the event. First of all, it is temporally and spatially unlocatable. Second of all, it is actualized in various empirical happenings. And thirdly, it is responsible for a coherent, logical articulation of time. So those are the three characteristics. Temporally, spatially unlocatable, actualized in various empirical happenings, and responsible for a coherent articulation of time. So Deleuze calls the empirical manifestations of an event its effectuation. Through its effectuation, the event inscribes its coordinates within bodies, or what Deleuze refers to as the depth. But it is only when there is a surfacing of the various bodily coordinates that the event becomes apparent, that it becomes flesh, and that it unleashes its full power. But how do we know when the moment has come, or when the event has come to the surface? It necessarily, just like in the third synthesis, it necessarily comes in the form of an empirical encounter. Something in the world, says Deleuze, or what Deleuze calls a dark precursor. A fight begins, a glass of wine breaks, a corpse is found in the alley. Quote, every system contains its dark precursor which ensures the communication of peripheral series. There is no doubt that there is an identity belonging to the precursor and a resemblance between the series which it causes to communicate. This there is, however, remains perfectly indeterminate, end quote. The event is thus temporally locatable only through its effectuation, but its effectuation does not cancel its unlocatable hovering and its influence over time, an influence that overflows the present of the effectuation. Because it has this type of organizing force, because it is an epicenter of communication, the event can be said to correspond to a form of transcendental principle. The event is not a cause, nor an effect. Rather, it orchestrates the logical distribution of causes and effects. As Daniel Schmidt notes, Deleuze's event is, quote, never exhausted by its various actualizations, end quote. This means that we can now distinguish between two kinds of attitude in relation to the event. On the one hand, there is a way to reduce the event to its effectuation. This belongs to the past, or it will happen when it happens. On the other hand, there is a way to free the event from its concrete effectuation. This requires an encounter with a dark precursor that enables a vision of the event. The dark precursor sets us on a path of thought, because the event can only be thought. Sets us on a path of thought that generates a doubling of the event into thought, or what Deleuze would call counter-effectuation. There's the effectuation, and you have to counter-effectuate it. So I'll come back to this very crucial possibility of the event, that of always being susceptible of being counter-effectuated. But for now, it suffices to define it as a twofold operation. It is the tracing back or the doubling in thought of all the micro-effectuations that led to the event and that now become visible in light of the encounter. And secondly, it is also an opening in the future that is done according to the full power of the event, measured in its doubling in thought. In other words, the counter-effectuation requires to take the event as a transcendental principle that makes time the way it is, rather than as an accident that occurs within a preconstituted time. As I will now try to show, there are ethical consequences to that. The first attitude negates taking the event as a pure accident, it negates the event as event, and it is bound to generate bad responses that Deleuze will call resentment and resignation. Whereas the second way is a way to, what Deleuze would say, become worthy of the event. Let's see how that plays out. Brings me to my second part, where I sort of take a case study. Trying to look at what it would look like to think of extinction as an accident, or how to become unworthy of the event. On January 23rd, 2024, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists announced that they would maintain the position of the minute hand on their doomsday clock. Since 2023, the clock has been indicating that humanity was 90 seconds before midnight. According to the Bulletin's website, the clock stands as a metaphor of, quote, how close we are to destroying our world with dangerous technologies of our own making, end quote. Although the clock represents a probability, especially during the Cold War, when its main role was to indicate the likelihood of an extinction event that would have been caused by the use of nuclear weapons, the image that fuels the metaphor is temporal, so a probability that is temporalized in a sense. a certain quantity of time separates us from extinction, and the shorter it is, the higher the likelihood of our own self-annihilation in the immediate future is. So what the clock expresses is a possibility, yet its mode of expression is a duration. Representing the likelihood of extinction by a temporal distance is a way to affirm that it is not here yet. It is also a way to affirm that its occurrence, once it comes, will be conjugated in the present tense, i.e., its being is exhausted by an accident that occurs empirically at a point in time. And this is the view that I want to put into question here. In his book, The Precipice, from 2020, moral philosopher Toby Ord develops a concept of existential risk. This concept is proposed as an extension and a variation around the notion of global catastrophic risk, which Nick Bostrom and Milan Surkovich had developed in the eponymous volume that they edited in 2008. So, Ord's concept is similar to the metaphor of the doomsday clock, insofar as it constitutes a call to take seriously the possibility that humanity might destroy itself in a future that seems to be increasingly close to the present. Ord uses the term existential to reveal that what he understands to be truly at stakes when we talk about threats of global destruction. According to him, the issue cannot be quantified as a percentage of human lives that would be lost in the catastrophe to come, nor as a definitive measurement of our environment that would attest to the possibility or impossibility for life to flourish in the aftermath of destruction. I'm going to quote him here. An existential catastrophe is the destruction of humanity's long-term potential. An existential risk is a risk that threatens the destruction of humanity's long-term potential in terms of the set of all possible futures that remain open to us. End quote. Humanity's long-term potential is the subject of extinction. It is what gets destroyed in extinction. If the long-term potential of humanity, i.e., quote, the set of all possible futures that remain open to us, end quote, is fully compromised or utterly shattered by a state of affairs occurring at a certain point in time, then we are in presence of an existential catastrophe. The existential risk corresponds to the state of affairs that are already actualized in the here and now or on their way to be, and which are likely to engender existential catastrophes. So this includes, for instance, the felt effect of climate change, the manufacturing of nuclear weapons, and the vulnerability of the Earth to asteroids and comets. This means that in the present, future possibilities are open for humanity. The advent of an existential catastrophe would engender the loss of these future possibilities. This would mean the loss of artworks that have yet to be created, or of technologies that have yet to be invented and developed, but most importantly, the loss of human lives that have yet to come into existence. So according to Ord, this would represent a moral failure on our part for at least two reasons. First, it would signal our failure to carry out the project of morality itself, because he argues that humans are the only being we know that are responsive to moral reasons and moral arguments. Okay, that was him, end quote. The destruction of humanity necessarily means that, quote, the capacity to push towards what is best or what is just will vanish from the world, end quote. So that's the first reason. Secondly, it would also signal our failure in carrying out our responsibility to ensure life for humans of the future. So he establishes an ethical equivalence between our responsibility towards a life that is spatially distant, someone very far from me, and a life that is temporally distant, an individual that who has yet to be born, right? So those are the two main reasons. Failure of carrying the project of morality and the failure to recognize our responsibility to people who are temporally distant. Now, okay, I believe that the biggest problem in this framework is made obvious by this sort of twofold account of moral failure because it reveals, I think, the insufficiency of his concept of possibility. In his framework, possibility is understood as a collection of non-actual states of affair that could become actual in the future, all the things that the future holds. This leads him to treat the future as a succession of presents that have not yet come to pass. However, Understanding the future as a type of present results in the inevitable conflation of the possible and the actual. We can only feel a sense of actual responsibility toward an individual that has not yet come into existence if we subordinate their existence to a regime of presence. That means if we construct a sort of counterfactual argument in which we treat the possible individual of the future as if they were already endowed with a form of presence. Of course, this is not to say that no ethics should be concerned with the future and the possibilities of the future, right? On the contrary, I think that this calls for an ethics that would thematize the relationship between the what is and the what is to come without emptying the future from its actual futurity, from its true futurity. That said, it is crucial to note that such inconsistencies in the ethical realm are, I think, symptomatic of a broader misinterpretation of the temporal structure of the event. Indeed, adopting this type of, flawed conception of possibility leads to a concept of extinction that is subordinated to presence and that is thus stripped of its innermost sense of futurity. Ord's account of possibility is central to his concept of extinction in two main ways. First, as we just saw, it indicates what is lost in the existential catastrophe, right? Quote, "An existential catastrophe is not just a catastrophe that destroys a particularly large of human lives, it destroys our potential," end quote. Secondly, it describes the temporal status of the existential risk. The existential risk is the possibility that the existential catastrophe happens. Just like the doomsday clock metaphor, where the midnight point is a future that can always sort of become present, the existential catastrophe is the possible present to come, as it is signaled by the existential risk. So it is a series, a chronology articulated in a linear unfolding, that does not communicate yet with the series of our present. Nonetheless, it is preemptively articulated according to a grammar of presence. In light of what we just observed about Ord's definition of possibility in the ethical realm, the pretension that the existential risk might tell us something about the future starts to appear dubious. So, using Deleuze's terminology, we could say that what is described in the existential risk is the probability of an accident rather than the effectuation of an event. So, this brings me to my sort of ethical claims here about resentment and resignation. It could be argued that the notion of existential risk is, on the contrary, the highest form of acknowledgement of the event qua event, right? By conducting surveys on the objective threats that hover over existences and that are susceptible to jeopardize the flourishing of our civilizations, are we not precisely investigating the various effectuations of the event? Is it not what we're doing? Are we not scrutinizing the different ways in which it gets inscribed in the flesh of things? I think we must answer here that, on the contrary, by conducting such investigations, we fail to account for the event as a logical principle that accomplishes an articulation of time, as we rather analyze the way in which the event is articulated by a chronological time that encompasses it. The event is thus reduced to a succession of stages. It becomes summarized and exhausted by its effectuations. Indeed, the event of extinction is usually presented in various empirical stages, following a model of progressive decay and destruction. There's the warming, there's the drought, there's the famine, there's the contamination of the water supplies, and so on. And that's fine. But the problem arises when we take the event extinction as the telos of these stages, as if the event could only be accomplished as the denouement of this progression, as if extinction was not precisely, absolutely there in all of those effectuations. So it takes extinction as the denouement of this progression. This framing, I think, is problematic because, as we saw earlier, the event is both locatable and unlocatable in its effectuations. However, in understanding the event as fractured into various stages of completion rather than effectuated into various states of affairs, we fail to account for its paradoxical temporality, and we make its accomplishment hinge on a possible present to come. The event is never truly here. It has not impacted us yet. It will only impact us when it becomes present, when the catastrophe comes. In other words, the event will come in the future, but this future is also a type of present. And this, I believe, is a way to underestimate the potency of the event, and ultimately to set the stage for a bad response to its demand. What ends up happening is that we proceed to inscribe the event, the violence, deeper in the flesh, further down within the materiality of the world. But how does that happen? How can the prediction of an impending destruction, a doomsday clock, or a precipice prevent us from responding adequately to the threat of extinction? It appears to be a commonly accepted trope that the urgency induced by the threat of an annihilation should be a motivating factor par excellence to make us change our ways, right? Like the burst of adrenaline that makes the body strong enough to extirpate itself from a burning, crashed car. Once again, Deleuze's account provides us with a way to understand the insufficiency of such an argument. According to him, in the face of an event, the response that attempts to cancel, negate, or solve the event is a form of denial of its power. This denial leads to resentment. Quote, to grasp what happens as unjust and unwarranted, it is always someone else's fault. This is what renders our wounds repugnant, resentment in the flesh, resentment against the event, end quote. Here, resentment must be understood as a sort of hostility that impoverishes the one who feels it. For instance, in regard to the threats to humanity that are posed by climate change, the potential figures of resentment are numerous. The public and political discourses that emphasize the sense of urgency that we face, even though they are often the source of prodigious collective mobilizations and transformative actions, are also fueling various avatars of climate denial, defensive fossil fuel advocacy, and nihilistic accelerationism. For example, the ban on laboratory-grown meat that was passed in the state of Florida in early May 2024, it gave rise to a very polarized debate. So on the one hand, advocates of the technology, who are either investors interested in its wide implementation, or climate activists concerned with the environmental impact of the meat industry, tend to promote cell culture meats as a quasi-messianic solution to the devastative effects of mass factory farming. On the other hand, we witness a strong defense for the maintaining of the current state of the meat industry, which takes the form of a denial of its negative impacts. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis went as far as claiming that the farming industry needed to be protected, quote, against an ideological agenda that wants to finger agriculture as the problem, that views things like raising cattle as destroying our climate, end quote. So both these positions involve degrees of resentment and resignation. Responses are targeted at empirical terms in the world, groups, people, political parties, economic interests, lobbies, etc. This either makes us resentful, so it makes us want to plot our revenge against the targeted terms, or resigned. It makes us want to give up, to suffer the effect of the event. So instead of reacting to the event, that is, to become resentful, one should, according to Deleuze, will the event. I'm going to quote him here. What does it mean to will the event? Is it to accept war, wounds, and death when they occur? Is it highly probable? It is highly probable that resignation is only one more figure of resentment, since resentment has many figures, end quote. The idea is therefore not to simply accept nor to passively suffer its effects. The only way to avoid the two pitfalls of resentment and resignation is to make the event appear beyond its effectuations. As long as the event is perceived as an accident that occurs at a defined point in time, we run the risk of either falling into resentment, which results in us becoming agents of destruction, or of giving in to resignation, which results in us suffering the effects of the destruction that is already in motion. Those two pitfalls are ways to become unworthy, indigne, of the event. This is because there is a true futurity of the event that is not reducible to a form of anticipated presence. I'm going to quote here Deleuze, "The event is not what occurs accident. It is in what happens the purely expressed that signals us and awaits us." End quote. So the event awaits us, but not as an accident that may or may not occur. In order to see what awaits us, we must encounter a dark precursor and engage in a trial of the event. We must experience the vision of the event that extracts it from a state of affairs, or various states of affairs. For instance, I can project myself into the time after my own death. If I think about it as another presence, the only thing I can envision is a sort of void, the impossibility of that presence. I can also picture like stereotypical imageries of hellscapes or limbos or heavens, or any sort of afterlife that could provide me with a form of soothing presence. If I stick to these visions, I will either become resentful or resign. This is it. I can't help but die one day. I might as well kill myself. Or let's not think about it. Resentment. But if I see the event beyond the empirical moment of my death, what will appear to me is the future as the empty form of time. This is the accomplishment of the third synthesis, the effondrement that reveals the groundless, that makes the unequal rise to the surface. The ethical injunction that emerges then is to, quote, not be unworthy of what happens, end quote. That is, I must equalize myself to the unequal that rises, not resisting it, nor suffering it. I have to play it like an actor plays a role, and playing it requires to will it. Willing the event, as we shall now see, requires us to engage in its counter-effectuation. So I'm my last part here. So the pure event of extinction as humanities cracking up. That's sort of where I want to end here. In logical sense, a key interlocutor in the discussion of the event is Francis Scott Fitzgerald. Deleuze describes how his short story, The Crack-Up, operates an extraction or distillation of the pure event beyond its empirical avatars. It is an autobiographical short story that traces back the effectuation, in the flesh of the writer, of a crack, which Deleuze calls une fêlure, in reference to the fêlure that splits the subject in the third synthesis of time. The interaction between what Deleuze and Guattari calls, in A Thousand Plateaux, the molecular and the molar, is useful to understand here the interaction between the events' various series of effectuations. Many of its effectuations remain below the level of perception or camouflage in the background until they become articulated by the encounter with a dark precursor, which reveals the event as a logical principle. Fitzgerald realizes all of a sudden, in a sort of encounter, that he has become a crack-up, that he has cracked like an old plate. The writing of his story is a way for him to engage in a counter-effectuation, a trial of his life that connects together series that had never been connected together before. Disseminated across the multiplicity of mycological cracks, it is impossible to locate the event at a specific point in time or to reduce it to a present. However, it is possible to pinpoint the moment of encounter that set him on the path of thought. This is how the counter-effectuation begins. Now, while Fitzgerald's story proceeds to show that, quote, all life is a process of breaking down, end quote, I wish to turn to another type of narrative to show that extinction might be read as humanity's very own cracking up, its fêlure that articulates and disarticulates time itself. In the same way that Deleuze said about Fitzgerald and Lowry that, quote, it is with all the gallons of alcohol that they drank that they effectuated the crack in their bodies, end quote, one could say that it is through all the gallons of fossil fuel that we have consumed that we have effectuated the crack in the flesh of our species, that we have opened ourselves to an undoing of time, a rising of the sans fond, the groundless, to the surface. Extinction thus reveals itself to be this power that redistributes the instituted temporal series by undoing their previous chronological articulations, revealing their fragility, their subordination to a synthetic activity, and the groundless that they conceal. In that sense, the event of extinction does something to time itself. The linear progression of our human historical time is fractured by the event of extinction, which distributes past and future according to the various ways in which we engage the event and measure ourselves to it. So you see, it's like, instead of being a cracking up in the life, it's a cracking up in history. That's sort of what I'm trying to pull off here. I'm going to quote Deleuze here. Such a symbol, a tremendous event, adequate to the totality of time, may be expressed in many ways. To throw time out of joint, to make the sun explode, to throw oneself in the volcano, to kill God or the Father. This symbolic image constitutes the totality of time to the extent that it draws together the caesura, the before and the after. However, insofar as it carries out their distribution within inequality, it creates the possibility of a temporal series. In effect, there is always a time at which the imagined act is supposed to be too big for me. This defines a priori the past or the before. It matters little whether or not the event itself occurs or whether the act has been performed or not. Past, present, and future are not distributed according to this empirical criterion, end quote. So what does that mean? The accidental form of extinction, the factual death of humanity, is not the caesura in question here. The caesura, the crack or the split, organizes past and future according to a reaction to the chaos, to the unequal in itself, that the event extinction reveals. So the event reveals the caesura, it reveals the chaos. Well, the caesura opens, chaos is revealed by extinction. Extinction remains in a sort of future present as long as it is too big for us. But we enter the future, or at least we free its infinite, chaotic, contentless deployment when we equalize ourselves to it. Basically, is the possibility of a new history, right? The free person, according to Deleuze, is the one who has grasped the event itself and who, quote, does not let it effectuate itself as such without operating as an actor its counter-effectuation, end quote. And this cannot be overemphasized for what I'm doing here, claiming that extinction as an event accomplishes the third synthesis of time as it denounces the illusion of the in itself. That's not a way to say that extinction should be celebrated, right? Its violence remains absolutely unspeakable. It is for that reason that we should not passively welcome it and await its effectuation. The event, even though it has the power to disarticulate time, is not at all to be construed as the long-awaited advent of a form of messianic truth. The third synthesis of time is not revealing the truth of time once and for all. What it reveals is the grounding of time in the unequal. This revelation, it's not the accomplishment of a telos, nor of a final order of things. Its resurfacing can only call for new distributions, new groundings, which will, in turn, recover the very bottomlessness from which they emerge. So it's a call for creativity, basically. That leads me to my very quick conclusion here. Learning from the event or towards a politics of counter-effectuations. The counter-effectuation is the most important concept, of course, here. It is our agency in the face of the event. In the face of one's own death, it is possible to become either resentful, we might want to become immortal, for instance, or resigned, we can become depressed or even suicidal. The counter-effectuation of one's own death can take many forms, but Deleuze mostly discusses writing. Writing is a way to extract the essence of the event, death, and to learn from it. In death, there is at least a lesson to be learned in what concerns the nature of time itself. And writing about it is a way to enrich life by introducing variations and creations into it. The logic of sense leaves us with the blueprint for an ethics of counter-effectuations that culminate at the individual level, as a command for infinite creativity. And the project of fleshing out this ethics has notably been undertaken by Leonard Lawler in his 2016 book, From Violence to Speaking Out. Now, I do believe that it is possible to apply this model to the problem of extinction. I think that this could potentially bring us to the crafting of a politics of counter-effectuations, and that this is the direction that I would like this project to take. I think that such an endeavor, although it would have to be approached very carefully, since it cannot be thought of as a simple application of the individual ethics to a broader collective scale. There is no direct equivalence between one's own death and the collective collapse of a world. However, I believe that the model of counter-effectuation offers us resources to think of collective deaths. Countereffectuating one's own death, one's own cracking up, or one's own mortal wound requires a doubling of all the micro-effectuations in thought through a form of trial that generates the elaboration of a coherent narrative. The counter-effectuation is, in that respect, backward-looking, insofar as it gathers the various effectuations of the event into a coherent whole, freeing its true power in an act of creation that opens the future. Counter-effectuating human extinctions is thus sort of twofold project. It is on the one hand a form of apprenticeship that requires us to become sensitive to its effectuations as its effectuations. Just like in psychoanalysis, I must realize that what is played out in every cigarette I smoke is truly my own death. We collectively must realize that what is played out in every new fossil fuel exploitation is truly humanity's very extinction. On the other hand, counter-effectuation is also this creative act that requires us to subvert the event by introducing novelty within it rather than repeating it. Such novelty is precisely what is unleashed by the rising of the groundless to the surface, which the vision of the event allowed for in the first place. In other words, a counter-effectuation requires us to introduce creative variations in scenarios that we seem doomed to repeat or suffer. The question that we now have to face is that of evaluating whether collective trajectories can be counter-effectuated, that is, if a politics of the event can be derived from an ethics of counter-effectuations. Thank you.